Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling on the Sask Party government to address the lack of support for childcare centres in the province. Mr. Speaker, those who have signed the petition wish to draw our attention to the following points: that childcare is essential to the economy, yet most centres struggle to balance their budget. This issue threatens both the number of childcare spaces and the quality of care. Mr. Speaker, of course, this was before the pandemic. Since then, the concerns have only grown more urgent. Quality childcare has an enormous positive impact on a child's future outcomes and yields high rates of economic return. Yet, Mr. Speaker, funding for childcare centres has been flat, and those professionals who work in childcare centres toil under appallingly low wages. Childcare centres are institutions of early learning and childhood development. It's appropriate that they have the same tax treatment as schools, Mr. Speaker. It's also appropriate that they deserve the level of support that befits their role, as we've seen through this pandemic, as essential workers, essential to parents, to children, and our economy. I'll read the prayer, Mr. Speaker. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan recognize that licensed nonprofit childcare centres provide programs that are foundational to a healthy society by including them in the Education Act, and exempting all licensed nonprofit childcare centres in Saskatchewan from property tax through changes to appropriate legislation. Mr. Speaker, these petitions have been signed by people right around the province. Those that I am tabling today come from Moose Jaw, Melfort, St. Brew, Rose Valley, Saskatoon, Milestone, Regina, and Punashat. I do so present.
Recognize the member for Carrot River Valley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax in the province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, this is a tax that does absolutely nothing to help the environment. It's just a tax. It shackles our industry in Western Canada, from farming to mining to oil extraction. It also affects our lifestyle, increasing costs to take our children to play sports, increasing costs to operate our schools, therefore increasing costs to education. I know the opposition supports a carbon tax along with their brethren in Ottawa, but really they should be supporting Saskatchewan people and our Prairie Resilience Plan. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the Government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax in the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the good citizens of Carrot River, St. Brew, Tisdale, Arborfield, and Martensville. I do so present. Here.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier doesn't get it. He doesn't get why we're here. When he finally agreed to come back to the legislature, Saskatchewan people expected to see a real plan. Instead, what they got was a cut-and-paste rehash of the same budget that was out of date in March. They tried to squeeze it through then. It didn't make sense then, and it certainly doesn't make sense now, especially since he was left out and hid huge pieces of what goes into making a real budget, Mr. Speaker. Now, we were flexible. We know the Premier promised to come back for 28 days of assessment of a budget. We said 14, that's okay. We take this work seriously. We take the current moment seriously, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the Premier is not taking this session seriously. He's not taking his responsibilities to Saskatchewan people seriously, and that's why I've written to him today about a return in September to get a real budget, Mr. Speaker, so that we can have a full accounting of the $200 million contingency fund, and so that we can finally see the projections for revenue and expenditure that this government has chosen to hide, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier commit today to returning in September and presenting a real budget?
Hear, hear, hear.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition is asking for essentially here today is a do-over. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition wants a mulligan on this session. Mr. Speaker, there's going to be no do-over here, Mr. Speaker. We have achieved through this session what we set out to achieve. We have passed the legislation that's been in the House. We have introduced, and very shortly we will be passing a budget, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the people of this province, the first provincial budget or national budget to be introduced and passed post-COVID, Mr. Speaker, in the nation of Canada. We're not coming back to the legislature, Mr. Speaker, this fall for a debate. We are going to have a much, much larger debate here in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, a debate in community after community, from corner to corner in this province that is going to culminate with a vote, Mr. Speaker. It's going to culminate with a provincial election on October the 26th. Mr. Speaker, in that election, Mr. Speaker, people of this province are going to have a choice. They're going to have a choice. They're going to be able to choose which party is best to engineer, Mr. Speaker, the economic recovery of Saskatchewan post-COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, they are going to be able to choose which party is best to grow the economy of this Saskatchewan, this province, Mr. Speaker. We are very confident in the plan that we are putting forward. Maybe the Leader of the Opposition and the NDP are looking for a second opinion on theirs, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I've had enough. Saskatchewan people have had enough of a Premier who doesn't take his job seriously, Mr. Speaker. Members on this side have spent this session advocating for the needs of Saskatchewan people, asking the tough questions and raising the real anxieties that Saskatchewan people are presenting, Mr. Speaker. People looked at this budget expecting a real plan, and instead they saw nothing to deal with the huge challenges in long-term care, nothing to deal with the challenges of coming back to school safely in September. A budget that said we're going to lose 16,000 jobs and just presented that as the way it's got to be, with no plan, no action to address those job losses, Mr. Speaker. We raise these questions about the people's concerns across this province, and the Premier stands up and says, oh, everything is fine, Mr. Speaker. The Premier has taken the concept of social distancing a little too far, because he's completely out of touch with the reality of Saskatchewan people, Mr. Speaker. People are really hurting. Real people are experiencing real concern. They deserve a real budget and a real plan so that when we come out for an election, they've got a real information on which to make a real choice.
Here, here.
Recognize the Premier.
Here, here.
Mr. Speaker, there is going to be no do-over. We are putting forward a real plan for recovery in this province, a real plan for growth, Mr. Speaker. And October 26th, the people of this province are going to have the opportunity to really vote, Mr. Speaker, with who they believe has a better plan, Mr. Speaker, to grow this economy, to recover the economy, Mr. Speaker. We're not coming back to the legislature. We are going to have a much larger debate on the doors, Mr. Speaker, on the telephones, Mr. Speaker, in community after community across this province. We're putting forward our plan, Mr. Speaker. We're confident in our plan, and we're going to put it to the people of this province in October.
Recognize the Leader of the...
Pardon me?
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker thought you had. Mr. Speaker, this Premier is hiding his true plans. He's not telling people what he plans to cut. He's not telling people what he plans to sell off. He's not telling people how many public jobs will be lost, Mr. Speaker. He wants to tell us that everything's fine. He wants to say, just trust us, Mr. Speaker. Well, just trust us doesn't cut it, Mr. Speaker. Not in a time like this, not any. And what this Premier has presented is an incomplete, lazy document that left out huge portions of what makes a real budget. No projections of the revenues to come, no projections of the deep pain he plans to cause Saskatchewan people if he gets a chance to be re-elected. Mr. Speaker, it's an insult to Saskatchewan people. It's a slap in the face to people who are out of work, to people who have no access to childcare, to people who are worried about how their kids are going to go back safely to school in the fall, Mr. Speaker. What we want to know, what people want to know, what people deserve to know is why the Sask Party is so desperate to hide their plans. What are they so ashamed of that they won't come back in September and present a real budget and a real plan?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Premier.
Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been very focused in government, Mr. Speaker, up to and including coming into this House. Mr. Speaker, we were focused on the necessary restrictions that were put in place. Mr. Speaker, we were focused on the resources that we provided to people, Mr. Speaker, and to businesses across this province, Mr. Speaker. And now we are focused on the recovery of the economy here in the province of Saskatchewan. We're doing that through the first step, Mr. Speaker, which is our Reopen Saskatchewan plan, which will, for all intents and purposes, be complete today, Mr. Speaker, with all businesses across the provinces that will be announced to be open today, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that Reopen Saskatchewan plan is a methodical, it is a strategic plan, Mr. Speaker, and it is a safe plan to reopen not only our businesses in this province, but to reopen our communities, our schools, Mr. Speaker, and to get back, Mr. Speaker, to the life that we enjoy in our communities. Mr. Speaker, all of this is done, Mr. Speaker, in conjunction with the budget that was introduced and will shortly be passed in this House, which is another step in setting the stage, Mr. Speaker, so that we can get back to not only recovering the economy here in Saskatchewan, but growing that economy and starting to hit the targets that we had set out in our growth plan, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the people of this province, and we have every intent of continuing to achieve the targets that we put in that plan, Mr. Speaker, because this province has what the world needs as the world recovers, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to provide it.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
We came back to this Assembly to scrutinize a budget, one that was supposed to step up to this historic challenge that we're facing. But that's not what the Sask Party presented. This budget fails that test by every measure. It fails to make the investments in people that are needed to secure our recovery. It fails to give the straight goods when it comes to the budget, their mismanagement, and their damaging plans for cuts and sell-offs. And it fails to present anything new to put people back to work. In fact, the only thing in this budget related to jobs is the Sask Party's admission that 16,000 Saskatchewan people will lose theirs. How is it that the Sask Party thinks this cut-and-paste budget that leaves us in recession is good enough for Saskatchewan people? Why won't they step up and commit to coming back with an actual budget that will put people back to work?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, not only is it sad that the NDP do not believe in the people of Saskatchewan and the fact that we can recover and we can grow this great province, Mr. Speaker, they actually can't criticize the existing budget, so they have to fearmonger for what may happen in the future, Mr. Speaker, because they don't want to criticize the fact that the health budget is up almost 5%, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to criticize that education is up over 2%, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to say that that is something they don't want in the budget, but they're going to vote against it, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to say that they don't want the increases to our community-based organizations that do the heavy lifting for the vulnerable population in this province, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to say that that's a bad idea, but they just hate the budget, so we're going to fearmonger for down the road, which is what they do every single budget and every single election year, Mr. Speaker. Tell me, Mr. Speaker, what does 2007, 2011, and 2016 have in common? What they have in common is the NDP are going to talk about selling the crowns.
Here. Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
The Saskatchewan New Democrats have full faith in Saskatchewan people and are committed to the kind of recovery that works for them. But we have zero faith in that minister and that Sask Party cabinet minister, Mr. Speaker. The Sask Party's damaging choices have left Saskatchewan people and our economy vulnerable, and their plan contains nothing new to ensure Saskatchewan workers and Saskatchewan companies benefit from infrastructure spending. The best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour, and their past behaviour is one of handing contract after contract to out-of-province company after company. Why should Saskatchewan people accept the pinky swear of the Sask Party government this time that they're actually going to hire Saskatchewan workers? And when will we see a budget that commits to a Sask-first approach to procurement that will actually fire up our economy and put Saskatchewan people back to work in the jobs they deserve? Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, last year, as part of executive government procurement, 90% of executive government procurement, Mr. Speaker, was procured from Saskatchewan companies, Mr. Speaker, retaining Saskatchewan people, Mr. Speaker. In the Crowns, Mr. Speaker, of the 10 largest procurements in the Crowns, Mr. Speaker, tens of billions of dollars, Mr. Speaker. 90% of that procurement went to Saskatchewan companies employing Saskatchewan workers. Now, I heard yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition being critical, Mr. Speaker, of our plan to introduce community benefits into our tendering, which we've already started to do, Mr. Speaker. I met with the building trades, contrary to the assertion that the Leader of the Opposition made yesterday, Mr. Speaker. I met with the plumbers and pipe fitters, Mr. Speaker, to talk about our plans. Incorporating community benefits into our tendering, Mr. Speaker, will ensure that Saskatchewan workers are working on those contracts, Mr. Speaker. It's all part of our recovery plan, $7.5 billion in capital over the next 2 years, Mr. Speaker. That's a real plan to put Saskatchewan people back to work.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
It's rather astounding that the Sask Party would put up a guy that presided over a $1 billion overrun on the bloated bypass contract that went to Paris, France, Mr. Speaker, to answer that question. This budget, plain and simple, doesn't get it done for Saskatchewan people. Their so-called budget is totally inadequate in responding to the historic challenge that Saskatchewan people face. The Sask Party doesn't even come close to stepping up to addressing the backlog of $6 billion in schools and hospitals and care homes that are in desperate need of repair. Now is the time to invest in infrastructure, but the Sask Party's plan is a fraction of what's needed. And of course, time and time again, when they do spend some dollars, they ship them out of province, Mr. Speaker. By any measure, from the hidden plans to the inadequate response, this budget is a failure. Why won't the Sask Party come back with a real plan to invest in infrastructure and create jobs in our province instead of the one that waves the white flag and leaves us in recession? Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Hear, hear. I'm not sure the member listened to my last answer, Mr. Speaker. $7.5 billion, Mr. Speaker, in capital investments in this province over the next 2 years. That includes the $2 billion stimulus fund, which we announced about a month ago, Mr. Speaker, which is all aimed, Mr. Speaker, at ensuring the Saskatchewan workers get back to work, Mr. Speaker. We're addressing the capital backlog, Mr. Speaker, in this province. Significant investments in schools, 10 in the budget, Mr. Speaker, and another 6 as part of the stimulus funding, Mr. Speaker. More money, Mr. Speaker, to do maintenance in schools, Mr. Speaker. Preventative maintenance, Mr. Speaker, is at over $50 million, Mr. Speaker, a program that the New Democrats didn't bother having, Mr. Speaker, a program, Mr. Speaker, that is being touted by the school divisions as important to addressing the capital needs in their school divisions, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to support, Mr. Speaker, the capital needs in this province, Mr. Speaker. And if the member opposite doesn't think that $7.5 billion is a significant investment, Mr. Speaker, then I'm not sure what is.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, it's frankly remarkable that this government didn't add a penny to the health budget for operating in COVID pressures since their February estimates. These aren't copy and paste times, Mr. Speaker. There are pressures across the board in healthcare, whether it's loss of lives to suicide, the overdose crisis ravaging our cities, or the thousands of people on surgery and MRI wait lists. These are essential services, not contingencies. Why didn't this government create a real budget to address these issues, instead of hoping to scrape funds together from a contingency fund that has already been spent 6 ways from Sunday?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as far as the COVID response, Mr. Speaker, it's been documented many times in committee on the floor of this House that there's been many expenses that when we unfortunately had to scale back on much of the healthcare system to prepare for COVID, Mr. Speaker, that funds were redirected. There was funds that weren't spent for surgeries, Mr. Speaker, for diagnostics that could be redirected to COVID. Mr. Speaker, we're ramping those services back up now. Mr. Speaker, there's other costs that are fixed costs. Staff salaries, Mr. Speaker. In most cases, staff salaries are paid whether they were working on a COVID response or whether they were working on their normal positions, Mr. Speaker. In the instances where possibly, if there is a second wave, we certainly hope there isn't, or not a significant one, Mr. Speaker, we need additional funding. The Minister of Finance has very eloquently laid out how that will be paid for. Mr. Speaker, there is one thing I do agree with the members opposite, though. Absolutely, there are many pressures in many areas of healthcare for finance, Mr. Speaker. That's why, since we formed government, we've increased the healthcare budget by 65%. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, while other jurisdictions took a hard look at the risks associated with COVID-19 and the current conditions for seniors in long-term care and stepped up with resources to keep them safe and well cared for, this government didn't provide an additional cent over the February estimates. The budget didn't even mention seniors aside from a previously announced long-term care project. That minister knows that these care homes are in crisis, and the auditor continues to raise concerns about care. Will the minister recognize that failing to support the struggling long-term care sector was a mistake, and will the Sask Party come back with a real plan to put resources in place to ensure that seniors get the dignified care they deserve?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize the importance of long-term care for our seniors in this province, and we take that matter very seriously, Mr. Speaker. As far as the COVID response, Mr. Speaker, while we need to remain diligent, and we will remain diligent, Mr. Speaker, many protocols were put in place to protect our seniors. There's cohorting of staff, Mr. Speaker. There was restrictions put on visitors. Mr. Speaker, we recognize what's happened in other provinces, some with catastrophic results, Mr. Speaker. We were determined not to let that happen in Saskatchewan, but again, Mr. Speaker, we will remain diligent. And as far as overall long-term care, Mr. Speaker, we recognize we inherited a massive infrastructure deficit, Mr. Speaker. We've built 13 long-term care facilities. We've got one on the way in Meadow Lake. We've got one just announced in Grenfell, one announced in Larange, Mr. Speaker, and there's more to come.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, despite those words, the government isn't listening. Just yesterday, a family shared a story of their loved one's experience in long-term care in Outlook with Post Media. The family of 95-year-old Catherine Bourgeois said they were mortified by the care she received in long-term care. The SHA transferred Catherine to a care home that wasn't secure enough to meet her dementia needs, and she was frequently able to leave the facility. She developed a fungal infection, in part because she wasn't getting bathed. The family later learned Catherine had only received 2 baths in 53 days. To the minister, does he actually think that 2 baths in 2 months is acceptable? These stories are the norm, not the exception. Will the minister show some leadership and come back with the resources seniors need, like the $7.5 million they promised 4 years ago?
Good question.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, while I can't speak to individual situations in the healthcare system, Mr. Speaker, I will say this. There are many processes put in place for families who are concerned about the care that their loved ones receiving. Mr. Speaker, we ask them to, first of all, talk to the staff at the facility. If they're not satisfied with that, they can talk to management at the facility. Mr. Speaker, they have the opportunity to reach out to quality care coordinators around the province that do an exceptional job in helping to coordinate care, Mr. Speaker. They can also speak to the provincial quality care coordinator. Filling that, Mr. Speaker, they even have the avenue of going to the ombudsman. Mr. Speaker, I would say this: the home that the member opposite is referring to in the news story is an Outlook, Mr. Speaker. That's the very same home that my mother-in-law lived in for many years, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. The care she was received until her passing was exceptional. I have nothing but good things, Mr. Speaker, to say about that facility and about the outstanding people who work there.
Recognize a member for Regina Lakeview.
The SAS Party has received a failing grade from teachers, from staff, and parents when it comes to education. And their catch-all slush fund isn't instilling any confidence. If you've read the news lately, you'd know that teachers have raised concerns about the upcoming school year. Parents want a plan for schools to safely reopen in the fall. And retired educators are criticizing the top-down decision-making that this government has once again embraced. Their copy and paste budget, Mr. Speaker, needs a Control-Alt-Delete, and we're running out of time for the reboot that this budget needs. Their $200 million contingency will have to cover an unreasonable number of bases. So my question is this: will the government table a real budget with a real plan for education in the fall?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, that's a remarkable allegation, Mr. Speaker. Since when is engaging the STF, Mr. Speaker, the SSBA, the Ministry of Education, top-down, Mr. Speaker? It's engaging professionals in the education sector, Mr. Speaker, to help plan a safe return to school. Mr. Speaker, we've said on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, and if the member would listen, Mr. Speaker, that returning children to school in the fall in a safe way with teachers, Mr. Speaker, is our top priority, Mr. Speaker. We've relied on the advice of the Chief Medical Health Officer, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you that the plans from school divisions were due today, Mr. Speaker, in terms of how those plans are going to be implemented in various schools around the province, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be very careful to scrutinize those plans, Mr. Speaker. It's nothing but fear and panic, Mr. Speaker, from those members opposite. Mr. Speaker, the politics of fear don't work in this province. They didn't work in 2007, they didn't work in 2011, they didn't work in 2016, and they're not going to work in 2020.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Speaker, it's very disappointing that that minister characterizes the very real and pressing concerns of our frontline staff as fear-mongering, and he should be ashamed of himself. The president of the STF says, and I quote, "We know that social distancing in schools is going to be very difficult. We have buildings that are at or over capacity." End quote, Mr. Speaker. In fact, that number is 78 and growing. He says, Mr. Speaker, that the guidelines can't be enforced in most classrooms. Schools that have managed increased enrollment with portables won't have enough bathrooms to accommodate the guidelines. If the government had thought to track class sizes, they might be able to calculate the capacities that schools will require for social distancing. Why won't the SAS Party table a budget that accounts for the needs in the return to school guidelines? What, Mr. Speaker, are they hiding?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the guidelines that have been provided to us by the Chief Medical Health Officer are just those. They're guidelines to help ensure that children return to school in the fall safely, Mr. Speaker. They're aimed at ensuring that we protect our children and our teachers and all the other educational professionals in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. The response planning team has been excellent, Mr. Speaker, in providing guidance on a number of issues, Mr. Speaker. And as I've said, the return-to-school plans from schools and school divisions are due today, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we want to ensure that children return to school in the fall in as normal a situation as possible, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as part of that, Mr. Speaker, we know there's going to be some additional cost savings within the school divisions, totaling in the millions of dollars per school division, Mr. Speaker, based on the numbers that we have, Mr. Speaker, and including, Mr. Speaker, the fact that we have a $200 million contingency in this budget to deal with those effects of COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. We will be well prepared for children to return in a safe way in the fall.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
That $200 million contingency is inadequate and goes across all ministries, Mr. Speaker, and that minister knows it. Schools have until today, as the minister said, to submit their back-to-school plans. Today, Mr. Speaker, time is running out and funding simply has not materialized. Hand sanitizer and distancing where possible simply is not going to be enough, Mr. Speaker, and that minister knows it. What if the pandemic back-to-school plan requires more bathrooms, more subs, more teachers, more classrooms, Mr. Speaker? Teachers and staffs are already stretched to the max. Well, the minister would like to poke fun at the very real concerns that teachers have in this province, and I suggest that he listen to his constituents who have these concerns. Without the additional duties and challenges already that will be required for returning to school this fall, parents want to send their children back safely. Mr. Speaker, will the Sass Party put their money where their mouth is and table a budget that actually allows the safe return to schools and makes it a priority?
I recognize the Premier.
Done. Again, Mr. Speaker, we tabled a budget in this Assembly, the first budget in the nation of Canada, Mr. Speaker, with yet another increase to education, Mr. Speaker, the largest education budget in the history of the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the critic referenced a failing grade, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when there's a failing grade, then there's quite often a request to retake the test, if you will, or a do-over. Mr. Speaker, is what we are seeing in this Assembly here today, Mr. Speaker. There is going to be no do-over of this Legislative Assembly, Mr. Speaker. There is going to be a much larger debate that happens this fall. It's a debate that, yes, we are going to, if a past indicator is any indicator of future behaviour, Mr. Speaker, we are going to put our record to the people of this province, our record of building schools across this province, hiring teachers to put in those schools, Mr. Speaker, versus the NDP record of closing a school a month, Mr. Speaker, 176 schools total, Mr. Speaker. Our record of building hospitals, hiring doctors, hiring nurses, versus a record, Mr. Speaker, of closing hospitals. 52 hospitals closed under the NDP. Mr. Speaker, there is going to be no do-over in this legislature this September, Mr. Speaker. There is going to be a much, much larger debate in this province, Mr. Speaker. It is a debate where we are going to put our record before the people of this province. It is a debate where we are going to put this budget before the people of this province, Mr. Speaker, and it is a record, it is a conversation where we are going to put forward, Mr. Speaker, our plan to recover and grow the economy in the province of Saskatchewan. And on October 26th, the people of this province are going to have a choice. They are going to have a choice between recovery and growth, Mr. Speaker, and a cut-and-paste plan from 2007 from the NDP. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to October the 26th.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies to report Bill number 210, the Income Tax Amendment Act 2020, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered at Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill be read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 210 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
No.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 210 be now read a third time, passed under its title. Assembly ready for the question. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies to report Bill number 211, the Provincial Sales Tax Amendment Act 2020, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered at Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in committee of the whole in this bill and that the bill be now read the third time.
Minister has requested leave to waive consideration of the whole on Bill number 211, that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? Minister may proceed to move third reading. Recognize the minister.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the minister that Bill number 211 be now read third time, passed under its title. Assembly ready for the question? Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Recognize the chair of the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies to present its ninth report. The ninth report focuses on the committee's scrutiny role in its review of annual reports, the provincial audit reports, and for the period of September the 11th, 2018 to June 29th, 2020. During this time, our committee reviewed 44 reports and financial statements released by Crown corporations or related entities and reviewed chapters in 3 provincial auditor reports. I would like to thank the Office of the Provincial Auditor and the Legislative Assembly Service for the support they provide. I would also like to thank CIC and all Crown corporations for all their work and attendance at our committee meetings. I move the ninth report of the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies be now concurred in.
It has been moved by the chair of the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies. The motion be now concurred in. Assembly ready for the question. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
All right, go. This is your chance. Hit it.
Recognize the chair of the Standing Committee on Human Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Human Services to report that it has considered certain estimates to present in its ninth report. I move that the ninth report of the Standing Committee on Human Services now be concurred in.
It's been It's been moved by the chair that the ninth report of the Standing Committee on Human Services be now concurred in. Assembly ready for the question? Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that this House do now adjourn.
Deputy Government House Leaders move that the Assembly now adjourn. Pleasure Assembly to adopt that motion. Carried. This Assembly stands adjourned until Thursday at 1:30 p.m.